Hello and welcome again to Over the Hill Outdoors. This winter I went on a walkabout out on a frozen lake and spent 3 days out there just exploring, wandering about. And I made a series of videos about that experience, which I hope you'll watch. But I want to add one more video to that series, specifically about some of the hazards that one might encounter when spending a considerable time out on a frozen lake, especially if you're doing some overnight camping out there. For many years I was the leader of a local Boy Scout troop, and one of our favorite annual traditions was what we called our winter ice camp, in which we would spend 2 days and a night camping out on a frozen lake, almost always in sub-zero temperatures. Safety of the boys was always my top priority, and I'm pleased to report that we never had any accidents or injuries or other significant problems. But there are plenty of things that can go very wrong out there, the consequences of which can be deadly. So in this video I will address some of those potential hazards and then share some basic knowledge and precautions that, if followed, can help you avoid tragedy out there on the ice. The first concern that I think most people associate with winter camping is the extreme cold. And yes, it's a big factor, but proper winter clothing and shelter and sleeping gear have made temperature actually one of the least of my ice camping worries. Staying dry is key to keeping warm. So you take all necessary precautions to avoid getting your clothing or your sleeping gear wet, and dry bags. Dry bags should be standard gear on any ice camping trip. I almost always take a change of warm clothing in a dry bag, even on just day ice fishing trips, and I'll have to admit I've needed it more than once. Another key to avoiding hypothermia or frostbite out on the ice is minimizing the wind chill. There are few, if any, natural features out there on the ice to protect you from the wind, so a good shelter is essential. And don't underestimate the importance of securing your shelter down to the ice. Even if it's a calm day when you first put up your shelter, it's not likely going to stay that way. So get everything that's movable tied down firmly with ice screws. A few times I've actually improvised a temporary windbreak by using my ice fishing sled, and it worked very well. It was very helpful in reducing the wind chill and making things a lot more comfortable. One of the most unsettling and potentially deadly situations that I've experienced out on the ice is the disorientation that comes with fog or total darkness. Not being able to see the shoreline or any of the other landmarks, or to be in a total whiteout condition and not even able to distinguish between the lake surface and the sky. Those can make travel out on the ice not only difficult but very dangerous. On a big lake, a person can wander for hours in the wrong direction and never find the shoreline, let alone the spot where they parked their vehicle. Lack of visibility also increases your chances of not recognizing the dangers that are out there, such as thin ice or open water, in time to avoid them. If you get lost in the fog and you're still out on the lake after dark, your troubles are compounded, because now you're facing the prospect of surviving overnight in the cold and wind, and probably without a shelter or a sleeping bag. I've learned the hard way to always keep a compass in my tackle box, and to always take a bearing to my truck from where I'm fishing. A GPS is great, but don't rely solely on that technology, because batteries can die and electronics can fail. So having a compass and knowing how to use it is good backup insurance. My Boy Scout troop's favorite orienteering activity was nighttime navigation, where they had to travel a series of distance and direction legs without being able to see beyond the reach of their headlamps and while using only a compass. So on my recent ice walkabout I tried that, but this time out on the featureless frozen lake and in complete darkness, and this time without a compass. All I can say is that it's definitely not something I'd recommend, but it could happen to you if you don't put a compass in your tackle box. So get that done and avoid potential tragedy. I'll mention now just a little bit about ice conditions. I have fallen through the ice 5 times over the years, and they all had to do with ice conditions. But falling through is not the only hazard associated with ice conditions. You know, one of the big dangers is falling on the ice, on slick ice, breaking a bone, getting a concussion, and new ice is especially slippery. Even old ice or snow-covered ice can be treacherous too. So invest in a good pair of ice cleats or ice chains and wear them. Back to the hazard of falling through the ice. As I said, I've done it 5 times, but 2 don't count because I did them on purpose, making an ice rescue training video for my scouts. There are several situations where your chances of falling through the ice are greatly increased, and obviously the big one is thin ice. Thin ice is not to be messed with under any circumstance. There's lots of reliable web sources out there that tell you how thick the ice must be to be safe. Look them up, pay attention to them. But even thick ice can be dangerous once it starts to decay. Cloudy ice is not to be trusted, and once it develops that grainy or column structure, it's completely unsafe no matter how thick it is. One time I went out on a lake covered with 12+ inches of ice that I admit had started to become a little rotten. It was fine in the early morning when the temperatures were cold, but by late afternoon, when it got warmer, the ice had weakened to the point that I fell through on my way back to shore. Luckily I was close enough to shore that I could get myself out, but it was pretty scary and pretty stupid. Another time though, I fell through on good, clear ice, new ice that was about 6 inches thick. The problem this time was visibility. There was a skiff of snow on the surface that prevented us from seeing the actual ice, and a big lead had opened up overnight and then refrozen with only about an inch of ice. Luckily I was wearing a life vest, and because I was the lead person, I also had a rope tied to my vest, and a throwable flotation cushion was tied to the other end and was trailing behind me. There were, however, 2 big problems that I had not anticipated after I fell in. First, when I fell in, I splashed water all over the ice, which made it totally impossible to get any traction as I tried to claw myself up onto the ice and get out. And I didn't have any ice picks, which could have solved the problem, I think. The second issue was that because the ice was new and the surface was as smooth as glass, my rescuers, who grabbed the rope attached to the shoulder of my vest, they couldn't get enough traction to pull me out. Whenever they pulled on the rope, all they did was just pull themselves closer to me and to the edge. Fortunately though, my son, who was actually only in his young teens at the time, he thought of the idea of drilling a shallow hole in the ice with the ice auger and then using it to brace himself as he pulled on the rope. And as soon as he did that, I popped right out and was saved. But what did I learn from that experience? Well, number one, if I had been alone and without ice picks, I probably would have died. The last hazard that I want to mention is that of open water. It can occur for a number of reasons, but it often happens when a long crack develops out on the lake ice and then the 2 ice bodies drift apart. Or typically in the spring, an open water band can form along the shoreline as ice in the shallowest water melts before the main lake ice. The openings that I fear the most are holes that can show up unexpectedly almost anywhere in otherwise thick ice, but it's because either there's warm springs or bubble springs on the lake bottom, and these spring holes, they can remain open all winter, or or they could be covered by a thin layer of ice and disguised, or they could be completely hidden by a crusted layer of drifted snow. I once had a dog fall into one of these snow-covered holes. Luckily, I was able to crawl close enough out there and grab her by the collar and pull her out without breaking through myself, but until she fell in, that hole was completely invisible. We've tried a number of ways to cross these narrow strips of open water. Sometimes we've been able just to simply jump over them. Sometimes we've taken a plank or a ladder with us out there on the lake, and especially in late winter when the shoreline ice begins to melt. I even used my sled a time or two to cross these narrow strips of bad ice and or open water areas along the shoreline. However, a couple of times we've run into leads out there on the main ice that were so wide we couldn't get across them. Luckily, we've been able to get around them by walking, usually for quite a long distance out of our way, but I've always wondered if I could maybe use my ice fishing sled as an emergency raft or boat. So this year I decided to try it in a controlled situation where a failure wouldn't be fatal. I found that my smaller sled, which is only 54 inches long, could actually float me without any of my gear, but it was very unstable and it had only an inch or two of freeboard. I got around the instability problem a little by improvising an outrigger from the pair of ski poles and the bag of dry clothes that I usually have with me, but it still didn't make the raft safe enough to try in a real emergency situation. My larger sled, which is 66 inches long, worked quite a bit better and it was more stable even without an outrigger. I was able to go from ice to water and back out onto ice without swamping, but once again I would never consider doing it under real conditions unless my only options were either to try swimming across the lead, which is stupidity, or certain death from exposure out on the ice. So not good options, any of them. Well, that does it for my list of ice walkabout hazards, at least for now. There are plenty more that could be mentioned. I hope you found at least some of what I've covered to be useful, and I wish you now safe travels the next time you venture out on that ice. So good luck, have fun, and be safe.